Welcome everyone. I've got John Lande right next to me with the Dickinson Law Firm. John is the chair of the firm's Cybersecurity, Data Breach, and Privacy Practice Group and regularly contributes to the firm's cybersecurity law and banking law blogs. My name is McManigal. I work over at Holmes Murphy, and John and I are here today to talk about cyber liability, cyber insurance, cyber legal issues, and we've titled the presentation Data Breach, Now What? The activity ID number for those of you on the webinar is 287278, and you can email Christy Cronin if you've got questions or hiccups with registering for everything. John, anything to add?
Let's get going.
Sounds good. So the first thing we wanted to talk to all of you about is quick technical difficulty. Christy, I can't get, oh, there we go. Here's today's agenda. So first we'll discuss cybersecurity threats, cybersecurity liability, cybersecurity insurance issues, and then lastly, mitigating cybersecurity risks. Part of the miscommunication that John and I have been talking about on this issue is that these things are happening. They're probably happening in some of the businesses that you're currently working in right now, but until one of them pops through the network and then gains access to your network, it's really difficult to feel how common the threats are. So we thought we'd pull up a quick chart for you to show you a little bit about what we're talking about. So this is a Norse Corp attack map. This is live attacks throughout the world. Typically, there's animation with this that shows the attack origination, attack types, attack targets, and locations. We'll see if we can get it up and running. Well, if this isn't going to run, I'd suggest that if you're listening by webinar, you may be at a computer. And if you are at a computer, go to Norse Corp, NORSE-corp.com. And if you click on the live attacks map, it's pretty interesting and thought-provoking to see just exactly how many attacks are happening. This, of course, charts some attack types, but not all attack types. So it may scare you a little bit. So I'm going to kick it over to John, and he's going to discuss the type of attacks that we're talking about today.
So Reed and I were talking before the webinar started about all the different ways that cybersecurity threats, or all the different kinds of cybersecurity threats. And while there's an infinite variety, it seems, of ways for fraudsters to try to gain access to your organization's valuable information, they generally fall into two broad categories, or at least those are the two broad categories we're going to spend most of our time talking about today. The first is what's generally referred to as social engineering. It's where fraudsters use some public or some non-public as well as public information to try to entice employees or members of an organization into providing information or money to people that they think are legitimate, but in reality are the fraudsters. And then, of course, hacking is what I think a lot of us think of when we think about cybersecurity. We're thinking about somebody sitting in Eastern Europe or East Asia on a computer trying to break through your firewall. And it's important to understand that these two kinds of threats are not mutually exclusive. Very often social engineering is used as a means of gaining access to a system so that then the hackers can install a program that will give them access to more of your organization's information. But it's also important to understand as we talk through the rest of the presentation that the mitigation, liability, and even the insurance issues can be different depending upon the kind of cybersecurity threat. We're going to spend the bulk of our time, I think, talking about social engineering because that is where a lot of the threat is today. It's an excellent way for fraudsters to gain access to a system of an organization because, frankly, it's a lot easier to trick a human being than it is to break through a firewall. And I think it's helpful to understand this threat by looking at what can happen and what's happened to an organization. Medidata versus federal insurance is an insurance coverage dispute that's currently being litigated in New York. It's at the Second Circuit right now. But the facts of this are pretty basic and pretty common. Medidata executives had informed their accounting department that they were going to be engaged in merger and acquisition activity, and that they were going to need everybody to be on board and ready to move quickly if the need arose. Medidata, for perspective here, is a cloud-based health care data service company. They store medical records, they store information for healthcare practitioners. They're a fairly large company based in New York. Internally, Medidata, like a lot of organizations, they did business via email. Executives would email other folks in the organization with requests. And over the course of a day or so, Medidata, folks in the accounting department at Medidata received emails appearing to come from an executive. And the quote-unquote executive told them that a lawyer would be calling them up with instructions on how to initiate a wire transfer. According to the email, this was related to the merger and acquisition activity that was going on. Sure enough, a quote-unquote lawyer called somebody in the accounting department and asked for a wire transfer. The employee then told the attorney that authorization would need to come directly from particular executives. Well, lo and behold, those emails came from or on behalf of the executives and went to the accounting employees and told them that the wire transfers that were requested were authorized. So the employees sent out the wires, and $4.7 million went to China. Now, nobody became suspicious in this case until a second request for $4.8 million came in. And you might be thinking, oh my goodness, $4.7 million, how could anybody, just let that leave? But as Reed and I were talking before, Reed has some interesting information about kind of the standard loss that he's seeing. And I think what's interesting about that is that the amount of money at issue is large, but not so large as to necessarily trigger alarm bells inside the organization. And that's what exactly happened here in Medidata because of the size of Medidata. And I don't know, Reed, if you want to chime in with what some of those loss figures are that you're seeing.
Yeah, I'd just chime in really quickly and say that there's misconception out there that fraudsters or hackers are only going after the largest, most well-known businesses, Target, Sony, Medidata may be one of them. But what we're seeing through all of our clients at Holmes Murphy is that there's a downsizing to the targets. So they're going after smaller businesses, and the $4.7 million to a lot of Iowa-based businesses may be an amount that people would scratch their heads and pull their hair out as no way would I ever part with that voluntarily or by a fraudster. We've seen a rash, maybe 4 or 5 $38,000 losses. And I think that number relative to a lot of our clients and Iowa-based businesses is an amount that there can be email communication without a lot of verification. And we, like I said, we've had multiple claims for that $38,000 amount. We don't know if they're related or not, but $38,000 is a pretty specific amount.
And I think the key takeaway here is that depending on the size and scale of your organization, think about an amount of money that would be significant. You'd be upset if you lost it, but not so large that it would cause people inside your organization to necessarily think that it was an unauthorized or fraudulent request. And that's exactly what happened here in Medidata.
John, really quickly, I'd also add, now that we're thinking about it, that we had a client who was a victim of fraudsters on this, and they actually put the amount at their exact monthly rent payment and then extracted that multiple times, one time per month, but multiple times over the period of the fraud.
And the requests in a lot of these cases, and in particular Medidata, can appear to be legitimate. What was really interesting about Medidata is that the requests, the emails that were coming allegedly from the executives on behalf of the employees had the executive's picture, they had the exact email address them and cause them to appear, by all accounts, to be from the executives. And so one of the things that I always like to do when I'm talking about these case studies is look back at the sequence of events and look at what were some of the critical junctures. What can we learn about the defects in this particular company's control process? And one of the things that I think is often overlooked is the culture and environment inside your organization. That can be a threat. If your organizational culture is such that everybody is supposed to put their head down, do their job, not ask any questions, respond to email, act quickly, never use your judgment, that's a prime environment for this kind of social engineering fraud, because it means none of your employees are going to ask a second question when a request for $38,000 comes in, or some other amount of money that may not be large enough to trigger some kind of secondary review. Certainly the fact that nobody ever used the phone to verify requests that were coming in is a significant risk factor here. This fraud likely could have been defeated if somebody picked up the phone and called one of the executives directly. Employee informed the attorney of what the security procedure was. So the fraudsters didn't know what Medidata's internal authorization process was until the employee told them who had to send the authorization inside the organization. Once they knew that, then it's easy to go to LinkedIn, find that person's name, and send emails on behalf of that individual. And so to kind of conclude our discussion here of metadata, if we look at a couple of the key risk factors, risk factors that created this threat for that organization, it was the culture of the organization, such that nobody in the accounting department thought to ask any questions. And then, of course, that the employees disclosed that security procedure to the fraudsters who were actually talking to them on the phone. And what we see throughout social engineering is that your employees are actually one of the biggest sources of vulnerability inside the organization.
John, on that, I'd share that password security is a question that I get asked about pretty frequently. What's the best password? How do you do it? There are certain services out there. And you mentioned earlier when you were talking about fraudsters or hackers, I think of the same visual image, which is a person in a room somewhere with not a lot of lights on, drinking too much Red Bull, typing really quickly. I came across an interesting resource the other day. We'll see if we can pull it up. It's less dynamic than the attack map, but it's a link, and the link says "How secure is my password?" You can visit this and type in howsecureismypassword.net. I'm not vouching for the security of this site, so don't put your actual password in. But the point was, I think this idea that there's somebody like in that It's Pat movie, where the person is trying to crack a diary and his only tip is that it's in the dictionary and that they're manually entering numbers, is a really, really antiquated picture. So if I type in "how secure is my password," a lot of people will pick one based on the address or the state that they live in. So I'm going to type in Grand. Maybe I live on Grand Avenue. So if I type in Grand, it instantly cracks it. There's no person doing any of this. This is an algorithm. This is the most freely available password cracking algorithm that you can find, and it instantly cracks this. So what if you type in something a little longer? Does that matter? I just typed in basketball. I think I misspelled it, and it still only took 2 minutes. Well, what if you just pick a bunch of random numbers and letters? So it's not a word, it's not in the dictionary. No human is going to spend the time to do this. So I'm just going to type in letters. And I don't know what I typed, but that would only take this one day. So if you're a target and one of these algorithms is looking to crack your password, it's very easy. How can you make it memorable and still a little more difficult to crack? So if I go back to Grand, I type in the number 1 after it. Now we're at 1 second. I type in 2, and then I add a password or a special character. It's the special characters that really make this harder to crack. I thought I'd share that with you in case you're curious about how secure your passwords are. I'd tell you that mine aren't particularly secure. And then the idea that your employees are your weakest link, they're your weakest link in protecting, because as John said, it's significantly easier to trick a person than it is to force your way through a firewall. So we've seen a rash of email-related malware that is as simple as clicking on a link in an email that looks like it comes from an internal source. It's a mistake that happens all the time. I think it's avoidable with training, but that requires a time investment from everybody. John's comment earlier about if something is very email heavy, that might not be the best recipe. Some of our insurance carriers that we work with when it comes specifically to social engineering fraud are saying, we will cover a loss if you tell us or show us a protocol that requires a call from the receiver to the sender of the request. That's all that we need for coverage to kick in. But if you're doing business all electronically, all by email, and you're transferring money that way, then that may actually exclude you from the policy coverage.
So now that we've covered very briefly what the threat landscape is right now, I think what's of greater interest is who pays ultimately in the event that there is a loss. A lot of cases, the ones that get litigated anyway, involve an ACH or more typically a wire transfer of funds from a bank account because the fraudsters are interested in getting that money out quickly. With ACH, it can take a little bit longer. And then, of course, the other bucket of or category of information that the fraudsters are after, in addition to financial information, is your personally identifiable information, employee social security numbers, things like that. When we're talking about monetary loss, one of the critical things that organizations need to understand is that if they lose money from a bank account, suppose a hacker gets in and convinces their employee to wire money out of their bank, or worse yet, the fraudsters get into the online banking portal, have access to your username and password at your bank, and send out money out of your account without you even knowing about it. It's important to understand that your organization doesn't have the same consumer protection rules as you do in your life as a consumer. Everybody knows what Reg E is, Regulation E, even if you don't know it. Reg E is the consumer banking regulation that says your bank is on the hook if you are the victim of a fraud loss, but that only applies to consumers. It does not apply to businesses and organizations. There is a completely different legal framework that applies to losses to your deposit account at your business or other organization. Now, under the Uniform Commercial Code, which is what applies to your business bank account, the default rule is that banks are liable for a loss. So if fraudsters get in and suppose they hack into your online banking portal and authorize wire transfers without you even knowing about it, we start with the premise that your bank is going to have to reimburse you for that. But banks have the ability to shift that liability to you as an account holder. So your business can actually have that liability shifted to it if your bank and you have agreed to verify the authenticity of any payment order that's coming in using a commercially reasonable security procedure. And then, of course, the bank has to follow that procedure in good faith. And so what I see now is a lot of banks, particularly larger banks, have instituted procedures where they require not only a username and password to log into that online banking portal, but they also have some additional verification, for example, a callback procedure before the wire actually goes out, or requiring multiple people to authorize wires with multiple unique usernames and passwords, as well as some back-end security procedures. All because banks understand that when it's a business, the exposure is so much larger. When you're talking about tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars that could be wired out of, say, a payroll account or some other kind of account. And if that money just disappeared, for a lot of organizations, that could be crippling. And banks don't necessarily want to be in a position where they're having to pay that loss. And so it's important to understand whether or not your bank and you have entered into that kind of an agreement. And these rules will determine who ends up being responsible for a loss if either one of your employees or a hacker is able to actually authorize a wire out of your bank account without you knowing about it. The other big source of liability, or at the very least legal risk, is where data is exfiltrated from your organization. Think about the now fairly common scam where somebody in the HR department will get an email claiming to be from the CEO or CFO or some outside vendor asking for all employee W-2s. And of course, the fraudsters want that because it's got all of the information they would need to impersonate somebody. And if that happens, if that information is handed over to those individuals, then you have a host of responsibilities like sending out data breach notices to notify those individuals that their information has been compromised. Depending on the information that's compromised, your organization may be required to offer identity theft protection in particular states. For example, the state of California requires any organization that had Social Security numbers breached offer identity theft protection to those people who've been affected. You also have to comply with a patchwork of at least 48 different state data breach notice laws, some of which are incompatible with each other. For example, a data breach notice that satisfies the Iowa law will violate the Massachusetts law, and so you can't just have a cookie cutter notice that you send out for all of those. And then of course you may have liability to third parties. If you're holding data for other people, depending on what your organization does, you may have obligations to notify them that information has been compromised. You may have non-disclosure agreements depending upon the nature of the organization, as well as other contractual obligations to indemnify in the event that you are the source of a breach. Which brings us to the real question here is what happens if you can't find the fraudster? You got to look to insurance.
So these threats and fraudsters and hackers are continually creative and always aggressive, and they've fallen generally outside of what I'll call the traditional insurance policies, property, general liability, crime. The things or policies that have been developed over a course of decades, where the language at John's firm and the language at my firm on our general liability policy is probably very, very similar. Lawyers have argued about it in a whole host of circumstances, and generally there's a legal background or framework with which everyone's got some sort of understanding. Not saying that cracks still don't come up, but it's pretty steady. So when we talk about social engineering fraud, a lot of people or a lot of the cases will deal with whether that falls under a computer fraud provision in an insurance policy, right? Cyber computer fraud, clearly they must be related and there must be coverage. Well, that's not quite the case, and here's why. So computer fraud involves someone accessing your system and then taking your money. Social engineering is someone accessing your system, or at least playing their role in impersonating somebody who would have access to your system, and then you as an employee or an employer essentially voluntarily parting with your money. They don't take that money from you, you send it out. And it's that sending out or that voluntary parting that excludes it from traditional insurance programs. So hence cyber and the development of cyber insurance. Cyber is a name that I think creates some confusion. Broadly written or well-placed cyber policies function more as a privacy policy because it's more about the information that's gathered than it is the means with which it was gathered. So think about that as if I took work home with me and part of my job was to hold health information for clients or health information for coworkers, and the wind comes up and blows all of my papers away and I have thousands of names on there. A broadly written policy will provide that breach notification expense and the rest of the headache that comes with that incident. As a market, there are lots of players in this. Chubb, Travelers, CNA, Lloyd's of London, the market's developed over the last 20 years. When we were talking about general liability policies having similar language in a lot of cases, there is no set industry standard cyber insurance form. A lot of times, and I'm making note of this down here at the bottom of the screen, is that there will be limited grants of cyber insurance in policies that your business probably already has. If we've got a bunch of lawyers in the room or on the call, professional liability policies, we're starting to see bolt-on bits and pieces of cyber coverage. I tell you that while that approach makes sense, you should know what you're getting and what you're not getting. If you really want to understand the policy or really want that breadth of coverage so you can have an expectation of claim payment in the event of a loss, it's best to get a cyber standalone policy. Relative to other insurance products, it's pretty aggressively priced, meaning that it's relatively inexpensive. Now, again, that's relative, and we've all got different businesses here, but the pricing is stabilizing. The number of carriers interested in underwriting your business is growing, and the coverage is kind of flattening out a little bit too. First party and third party coverage part. So I thought it seemed like these topics are something that we should talk about. So if you're talking about first party liability, in the event of a cyber attack that results in coverage, so in these cases there's coverage, the carrier will pay for your business to repair the data that was compromised or lost. They will pay for cyber extortion. So one of the more common attacks that we're seeing now is somebody gains access to your system, and through one form or another, whether it's the denial of service or they just block, they create a firewall and they keep you at arm's length so you can't even get into your system. And then it's ransomware, they'll extort that data. And they'll say to you, if you want back into your system, you have to pay us $10,000 or $100,000 or whatever it is. You can actually get insurance coverage for that payment. Breach notification. Breach notification, I think, generally breaks down into two separate pieces. One of them is, think if you lost your wallet without your license. So if you lose a credit card, you lose some sort of data or information like that, or what you would do is cancel the credit card. You still need to notify those people, and that's not cheap, but it's a lot less expensive and a lot less painful than it is to tell somebody that you lost their license. Because now you've got a driver's license number, you've got a birthday, you've got a height and weight, you've got all sorts of other personal health information that's out there, and that is a much more pricey notification response. These types of acts tend to fall under crisis management. So there are specific public relations firms that your insurance carrier may negotiate rates with in advance to provide those resources for you, and they'll cover that expense. And then the forensic investigation, which is what happened, how did it happen, and how do we stop this from happening again. You also have some third-party coverages, which would be the result of a third party being damaged by a cyber incident. For example, a lawsuit from a class of consumers where their data was compromised because of an error or omission on your part, and that would go for a client as well. And then there's also state and federal agencies that could assess fines or penalties, and depending on the coverage, you can actually get the investigation expense reimbursed. Coverage considerations, I think this is mostly about knowing and understanding what you've bought to set the expectations you have in the event of a claim. The insuring agreements are generally written broadly. They're meant to provide a lot of coverage, and then it's these exclusions and sublimits that come and limit that coverage. So we'll see buckets, specifically in cyber policies that may say your cyber extortion limit is $250,000. Your policy limit will say it's $1 million, and then it will sublimit the cyber extortion to $250,000. We see that a lot with social engineering fraud as well. A lot of the carriers are willing to say, we understand if you if you send $38,000 out, but we're really not as understanding in the event that you sent out a couple million. And as always, the insuring agreement is broad, so the devil's in the details, which in this case are the exclusions.
And Reed, I think that's interesting because it's one thing, it's interesting to me that you have $1 million, say, of cyber coverage, but then, a sublimit of $250 on something like social engineering loss. That tells me the carriers think this is pretty likely to happen. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
I come at the insurance issue from the perspective of a litigator, somebody who sees what happens when the coverage is thought to be there, but then we get that letter back from the carrier that says, I'm sorry, no, we're denying coverage under your quote unquote cyber policy for one reason or another. What we see most frequently is insureds attempting to fit a square peg of a social engineering loss into the round hole of computer fraud coverage. There has been a lot of litigation in state and federal court all across the country over whether or not computer fraud coverage provision will apply to social engineering. And I'll just give you a kind of basic computer fraud coverage clause that I've seen in at least one case. And I don't know, Reed can tell me whether or not he thinks this is generally consistent with what he sees in the marketplace.
It is.
Thanks, Reed. The point here is that the computer fraud coverage provision is really geared towards something completely different from the social engineering loss. And the argument that a lot of carriers make when these cases get litigated is that when you're talking about social engineering, you're really talking about voluntary employee conduct. If you think back to the Medidata case, yes, fraudsters used unauthorized access or unauthorized computer code to mask their emails to employees at the organization so that it appeared that those emails were really coming from executives inside the company. That is certainly manipulation of computer data, unauthorized access to a system. But the critical events were all, or critical conduct all came from the employees when they voluntarily decided to follow those emails, follow the instructions in those emails. And what the carrier is arguing in that Medidata case is that the employee choice factor is crucial to deciding whether or not there's coverage under computer fraud. Now, if they had social engineering coverage, it may not be an issue that we're talking about, although there could be a different issue depending upon the way that fraudsters engaged in their attack against the organization. And so it's really critical for the organization to understand the coverage that they're buying and to work with a knowledgeable broker who has the information about cybersecurity policies, what's available in the marketplace, the different kinds of coverage options and expenses associated with those. Because when it comes time for you to need cyber insurance, is not the time that you want to be discovering for the first time what the limitations of that coverage really is. Because if you don't have insurance coverage, ultimately you may end up having to bear the loss, and so that's certainly not something you want to have to do. The insurance discussion is important, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that it's just one part of mitigating cybersecurity risk. And I think, Reed, that's probably what your organization emphasizes as much as anything as well.
Yeah, I would share with you that there are really three things that you can do to address the risk. John will go into more detail on each of them, but you can avoid the risk hopefully through training and employee engagement. You can reduce the risk in the event that it happens through litigation or the involvement of other attorneys, or you can transfer the risk, which would be the insurance piece of this. I'd also share that businesses are occasionally surprised with what's covered or what's included and what's not, and then how fast those dollars add up for those carrier resources that we talked about earlier. So I brought an example of a recent claim here, and the fact pattern on it is fairly straightforward. So it's a professional services team. This is not a Holmes Murphy client. It's from one of our carrier partners. And ransomware attack encrypted several files and said, if you want access to these, great, pay me $10,000. So they said, oh gosh, what are we going to do? They've got insurance in this case. So here's how fast this adds up. So they requested $10,000. The incident response coach who helped kind of project manage or negotiate this claim was $15,000. $75,000 for the forensics firm to go through and identify what's compromised and what's not compromised. And if that sounds straightforward, it's because I'm relaying it simplistically. Of all the data in your organization, identifying where exactly the fraudster got to and where they didn't get to is very, very complicated, because you don't want to zero in on something too narrow and then identify later that, oh gosh, we got to go all the way back through that with another forensic investigation. That forensic investigation was $75,000, and then there's a $10,000 ransom payment involved too. So if you do the math on that, it's essentially $100,000, and 90 of that is in things other than the ransom that you paid.
And just to further comment on the forensic issue, a lot of times you're trying to prove a negative. You have, for example, your company's crown jewels. Suppose it's a customer list that has information about your customers, including payment information, credit card information that you store for them because that's how they pay you. There may be a breach, something that happens inside the organization. Say somebody clicks on a link, now their computer's infected, you catch it, you go and you clean it off, but then you think, well, we need to go check and see and make sure that they didn't ever access that customer list with personally identifiable information, because if they did, we have to go send out a data breach notice. And so you're trying to prove that something didn't happen, which we all know is much more difficult because you have to think of all the different ways that an event could have happened. And you need to reassure yourself and get confident enough that something wasn't accessed, because if you make the decision not to send out the notices, and then later a consumer comes to you and says, wait a minute, my identity got stolen, I've traced it back to you, I think you're the only organization that may have been the source of that breach, then you've got a bigger problem, because now you've got state attorneys general who may have data breach notice laws that you violated coming after you, asking you questions about why you didn't send out a notice within 30, 45, 120 days of first detecting the breach. And so there's a lot of important things to be thinking about when you've got that forensic firm involved. When we're talking about risk and we're talking about mitigating risk, one of the first things that's important to do, that I advise clients to do when they're thinking about cybersecurity, is identify the crown jewels in your organization. Identify what is most important to your organization's continued functioning, because you're never going to be able to completely secure your entire system. You don't have the resources for it, you don't have the time, you don't want to ensure every aspect of your business when doing so would be cost prohibitive. What you need to do is you need to focus on what is vital to your organization. What could you not recover from losing? Is it all of the money in the payroll account? A lot of organizations may not have enough of a cash cushion to be able to survive having the payroll account emptied out because somebody in HR got an email, clicked on a link, and then wired the money to Poland. So you need to know if that's a risk, if that's something we can't survive, because if we don't make payroll, then all of our employees are now going to have Iowa Code 91A claims against us, which means we're going to have to pay attorney's fees for not paying them on time, which means we're going to owe double damages. You need to be thinking about those kinds of risks. Maybe it's a customer list that if your customers found out that that information was compromised, they wouldn't do business with you anymore. Or you've got a particularly important trade secret and you're worried about corporate espionage, and you've got a competitor out there in the marketplace that might try to come and break into your system and take that. Those are all the kinds of things that you need to be thinking about. And once you have that list of prioritized information that you're most concerned about, then you can start having a conversation with somebody like Reed intelligently about what kind of insurance products do we need to be looking at, and then talking to an attorney or other qualified individual to look at a audit process, control process that will help secure that information. Controls end up being critical here when we're talking about particularly moving money in and out of accounts. One of the things you need to do is make sure that you've got more than one set of eyeballs looking at a request to transfer money out. Now, depending upon the organization, that may become difficult, so you may want to look at thresholds. So, for example, we're going to let this level of supervisor or manager send out this amount of money, but anything over that is going to require a second set of eyeballs looking at it. One of the things that I think is interesting that I picked up at one of the conferences I was attending is a forensic expert who said, your biggest risk isn't your bad employees. Your bad employees, you kind of know who they are and you know their limitations. But when it comes to cybersecurity, one of your biggest risks is your good employees. It's the person in the marketing department who really wants to do a good job, who goes out and buys a piece of software that you don't know about, that doesn't get updated regularly and becomes a backdoor into your organization's network that you didn't think about. Your organization may require all email to be sent out in an encrypted format, but it turns out for whatever reason there are limitations on the file size that can be attached to those encrypted emails. We've got an employee who's going to be out for a week, and they want to be able to work on a project at home, and so they send a data sheet, maybe an Excel spreadsheet with client information on it, through their personal email because of the size limitation that's on the encrypted system that you use. And so now all of a sudden that information is out in the open. And under some state data breach laws, even if information is exposed to a risky environment, you may have an obligation to send a data breach notice. And so when you're designing your controls, you need to figure out, what are our employees actually doing? What are their jobs? And what do they need in order to do those jobs? Because you could certainly design a control procedure that just unplugs the internet cable from the back of every computer. But that's not really effective because nobody's going to be able to function. So you need to calculate and dial back the control just enough to allow work to get done, understanding that by doing that, you're leaving a little bit of window of risk that you probably want to try to insure against.
John, sorry to
No,
hop in on you.
absolutely.
One thing that I'd share is maybe the most common question I get is, this is scary. How do I even start? I don't know what my organization does. It feels like I'm a millennial, so I've been tasked with technology or however it works in your organization. I'd share with you that a really easily accessible point to start is if you just go online and look for an insurance application. Doesn't really matter what carrier it's from, could be Chubb or CNA or Travelers. And that application is going to have a whole host of questions. None of them are going to be premium related or anything like that. It's just going to say, do you have a callback requirement on a wire transfer?
Mm-hmm.
How do you engage your employees for this? Do you have a firewall?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's been a helpful framework for people to start thinking about the issue.
Mm-hmm.
And from there, it's intuitive, or at least the start's intuitive.
And continuing on with that thought, Reed, the FFIEC, which is a federal agency tasked with regulating and providing standards for financial institutions, has a tool, a self-assessment tool that it has designed for financial institutions to use. But we've actually used it at my law firm as a way of identifying the level of risk that our firm has for different kinds of cybersecurity threats. And a lot like with the insurance application, there would be some questions that maybe have no relevance to the kind of organization that you're dealing with. But there are a lot of questions that are broadly applicable, regardless of whether the organization is a financial institution or some other kind of organization. And so that's another good way to get started with the cybersecurity audit process, figuring out where are our vulnerabilities and what do we need to be protecting against. One of the other things I'd counsel you to do is to talk to your financial institution to understand what is your bank's procedure for verifying the authenticity of wire transfer requests that come in, understanding that there's a good chance your bank has shifted that liability from the bank to your organization in the event that somebody in your organization is tricked into sending out a wire transfer, or hackers actually get in and initiate a wire transfer on your behalf. And then ultimately, if you're not satisfied with what your bank is offering you, you might want to consider looking at different institutions that have a more security processes that is more compatible with your needs. When we're talking about mitigating risk, you want to be prepared to respond in the event of a breach. One of the things you want to know is who you're going to call, who are the lawyers you're going to call, who's the insurance agent you're going to call in order to help you make a claim, who's the forensic team that you want to call. I know Reed has some thoughts about the ways that those policies and the carriers can help with some of that incident response.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. I think that in the event of a breach, one of the most significant things or most important things that you can do is just make sure that you have access to resources. My hope would be that the first time you deal with this is the last time that you deal with it. And the first time you deal with it, it's never fun to take your maiden voyage into really choppy waters without a tour guide. I'd suggest that the carrier that you work with in the event of an insurance claim has been down this path many times before. And so have the forensic coaches and the breach response and the breach security policies have all been well developed. And so just access to those resources in a time when you really need it's been impactful for our clients.
And you want to be thinking about who those experts are. Some policies have provisions, sort of teams assembled already. Others certainly give you the ability to select your counsel. I know that I've been selected by different clients as their counsel that they're going to go to in the event that there's some kind of cybersecurity incident. And so you want to have thought about that process, because when your entire system is locked down by ransomware, you're not going to have a lot of ability to go fishing and finding who you're going to call to help with that response. It's also critical to know who has authority in these situations. If you realize that money is about to be wired out of your organization's account and it's not authorized, you need to know who to go to inside the organization to confirm that's true, and who has the ability to say, stop everything, stop the wire, and then know who to call at your institution and say, stop the wire, don't send it out, contact the beneficiary bank, and try to pull that back. On that note, there's a resource that the FBI has put out that allows you to actually go, and if you've been the victim of a fraudulent wire, you can provide the information about your bank, the beneficiary bank of the wire, and depending upon certain criteria that, as far as I know, are not public, the FBI may or may not have the ability to automatically kill the wire in transit, and so that reduces the chance that the money actually may disappear. But that needs to happen quickly. The FBI says that it can happen within 72 hours, although the chance of killing the wire decreases substantially over time. I think in reality it's much shorter than that. I think we're talking same day if you want to have a realistic chance of stopping the wire from either from leaving your bank or certainly leaving the country. You also want to think about counsel's role in the wake of a cybersecurity incident. One of the biggest challenges that I see when you've got a data breach sort of in progress is that everybody's calling everybody, emailing everybody. There's very little regard for who's in charge and who should be communicating with the forensic team, and whether or not there's any effort being made to protect work product privilege and attorney-client privilege. One of the other concerns is you don't know what's going on, and so you go out and you hire the first forensic team that you can find to come in and crawl through your network and try to identify what happened without giving them any kind of scope of work, because you haven't really done any kind of the work to try to figure out where is our risk, what should they be focused on. And so what the forensic team does, and they're very good at it, they go through and they generate a volume of all the vulnerabilities that exist in your network. And that volume then may or may not become part of discovery if you ever end up in litigation. And whether or not it ends up in discovery can depend a lot upon the scope of work that's provided to the forensic team, whether or not you're thinking about trying to maintain the work product privilege in the event that you end up in litigation with the carrier or with a third party whose information you've exposed, or some other entity or organization. So you want to have counsel involved in these cybersecurity incidents as they're happening, because they can be communicating with the forensic team, trying to narrow the scope of work to make sure they're only investigating the actual incident and not generating a roadmap that may be used in litigation to try to identify all the ways in which your organization was deficient in its cybersecurity planning. Just in general, got some general thoughts that Reed and I were kind of discussing before we started here. One of the themes that I see in a lot of the cases is employees trying to fix things themselves, or employees being afraid of having made a mistake, and so they don't always immediately report things. And that's an environment that, like I said earlier, is primed for some kind of cybersecurity fraud. If every employee feels like they're at risk anytime they make a mistake, they're less likely to report things up, and you may want your employees to cooperate very quickly. Think about the employee who wants to do work on the weekend and sends this Excel spreadsheet with the Social Security numbers through their personal email. You may want that employee to grant you access to their personal email accounts so that you can verify that you don't see any indications that they forwarded it to anybody else, that hackers haven't been in, or any other indicators that would suggest that that spreadsheet was exposed when it was in their personal email account, or just to confirm that they deleted it, because that could all be important information that you need to make the decision about whether or not to send out a data breach notice to your consumers. And if your employee is not cooperative because they're afraid they're going to get terminated, because they may have done something that was inconsistent with what you thought they should be doing, then that may make that whole process much more difficult. Now, I'm not saying you need to retain every employee who makes a mistake in the office, but you need to think about that before you make the decision just to terminate somebody because there was a mistake, or there was some exposure of data, or frankly a wire that went out. Because I think what metadata shows us is that the failure in that organization wasn't just at the level of the employee who sent the wire out. Certainly they made an error in judgment, but there was an entire cultural problem and lack of control that really wasn't that employee's fault. It was the responsibility of the organization as a whole to do something to mitigate that risk. Reed, I don't know if you have any other general tips or thoughts to add?
No, I think you covered it.
Just one last thing here. We were talking about resources. There's a number of resources out there that talk about cybersecurity. The FFIEC is one I don't have listed, but if you just go to search for the FFIEC, you'll be able to find it, and their self-assessment is available. I know Reed and I would certainly be happy to answer questions, and if nobody has them live, certainly email either one of us. And we'd be happy to respond.